Tonight's headline in Seoul is a courtroom one, and it's already reshaping the political calendar. A South Korean court sentenced former First Lady Kim Keon-hee to 20 months in prison on bribery charges tied to the Unification Church, according to multiple reports. Prosecutors had reportedly asked for a far heavier sentence, and the ruling immediately set up an appeal fight and a new wave of political backlash. The case centers on allegations that Kim received luxury items, described in reports as a high-end diamond necklace and a luxury handbag, from a Unification Church leader, with prosecutors arguing this was an illicit benefit connected to requests the church wanted the presidential office to help with. For foreign residents, the key isn't celebrity gossip about luxury goods. It's what this does to governance. Investigations involving high-profile figures tend to dominate the news cycle, absorb political bandwidth in the National Assembly, and raise uncertainty around budgets and legislation. It also puts pressure on prosecutors, courts, and political parties to prove they can enforce anti-corruption rules consistently, even when the defendant is closely connected to a former president. And the scandal isn't limited to one person. Separate coverage today highlighted another conviction in a related Unification Church money case. A ruling party lawmaker, Daejang-dong, received a prison sentence after being found guilty of taking illicit funds tied to a church official. That expands the story from a First Lady's bribery trial into a broader question about how religious organizations, donations, and political access are regulated, and whether existing transparency rules are strong enough to prevent influence peddling. What happens next? Expect appeals, new political messaging, and more scrutiny of donation networks. If you're watching Korea from abroad, this is a reminder that domestic legal decisions can quickly become national political shocks, and they often spill over into markets, diplomacy, and policy priorities. If you're living in Korea or planning to visit, tariff headlines are not just diplomacy. They can filter into prices, supply chains, and business confidence faster than most people expect. Reuters reported that U.S. President Donald Trump said he would raise tariffs on South Korea to 25% and keep them there until South Korea's parliament approves a U.S. investment bill. In other words, the tariff threat is being used as leverage in a political. That setup matters because Korea's economy is deeply exposed to exports, especially in autos, parts, batteries, steel, and advanced electronics. Even before any tariff takes effect, companies may delay orders, adjust shipping schedules, or reprice contracts because they don't want to be caught with inventory suddenly hit by a new duty. That's the announcement effect. The signal moves markets even before the paperwork does. For consumers, the short-term risk is not that your coffee price jumps tomorrow. It's that imported inputs become more expensive for Korean firms, and those costs show up later. In electronics, cars, appliances, and sometimes food packaging and logistics. For workers, the risk is that export uncertainty makes firms cautious about hiring and investment. Seoul's policy problem is also tricky. The demand is framed as something the National Assembly must ratify. But Korea's legislature is often polarized, and timing can become a bargaining chip. That raises the odds of prolonged uncertainty rather than a clean, fast resolution. Also watch how the rhetoric evolves. Reuters separately reported that Trump later signaled he might work something out on tariffs with Korea. That could mean a deal is possible, but it also means headline volatility is likely. Traders, businesses, and even travelers planning big purchases should expect rapid swings in expectation as negotiators trade messages. Bottom line, this is a political tool that can have real economic consequences. If you run a business in Korea, follow sector-specific updates. If you're a traveler, keep an eye on exchange rates and major consumer electronics pricing. Tariffs don't always hit tourists directly, but they can reshape the shopping landscape. Korea's National Assembly has been stuck in high-friction politics for months, but today brought a rare, practical-looking compromise. Multiple local reports said the ruling and opposition parties agreed to convene a plenary session in early February and process a large package of bills, around 90 in total, framed as livelihood or non-controversial measures. The deal includes procedural changes to the National Assembly Act and a push to move forward on a Semiconductor Special Act, both of which have been stuck in partisan bargaining. Here's why foreigners in Korea should care. When the legislature is gridlocked, it doesn't just delay political laws, it slows budgets, public safety funding, business incentives, and administrative rules that shape daily life, from small business support to housing administration and technology policy. A bill package like this can also shift expectations in markets. Investors interpret the assembly can still function as a signal that some policy uncertainty is easing. The Semiconductor Special Act matters especially because chips are Korea's national core industry, and because the global AI boom is turning memory and high-bandwidth chips into strategic assets. If the law expands tax incentives, R&D support, or infrastructure fast tracks, it could affect where investment goes and which regions see new manufacturing jobs. The National Assembly Act revision is more technical but politically powerful. It is being discussed as a way to adjust how filibusters or extended debates can be triggered and managed, effectively changing the rules of the floor that decide whether bills can be delayed, fast-tracked, or voted on in the plenary. If those rules change, expect both sides to claim they are restoring normal governance, while accusing the other side of trying to game procedure for advantage. One caution: this agreement is a snapshot. In Korean politics, deals can unravel if a single sensitive bill is attached, or if a big external shock changes incentives. Still, for now, the message is clear. Lawmakers are trying to show the public, on in global markets, that the assembly can pass something in a year of intense political pressure. Today's biggest business story is simple. The AI boom is paying Korea's chip makers, and it's changing expectations for 2026. Reuters reported Samsung Electronics posted an estimated fourth-quarter operating profit of about 20.1 trillion won, up sharply year-on-year, on record revenue of 93.8 trillion won. The company said profits in its device solution semiconductor business were about 16.4 trillion won, reflecting a strong rebound in memory and AI-related demand. In a parallel Reuters report, SK Hynix said its fourth-quarter operating profit came in at 19.2 trillion won, also up dramatically, as demand for high-bandwidth memory, HBM, used in AI servers stayed hot. The company even announced a shareholder return plan involving share repurchases and cancellation, a signal that management believes cash flow will remain strong. Here's the why behind the numbers. Modern generative AI models require huge data center buildouts. Those data centers are hungry for advanced memory, especially HBM, because AI accelerators need fast, tightly integrated memory to run efficiently. When memory prices recover, and when HBM capacity is constrained, margins can jump quickly. That's the cycle Korea's chip industry is riding right now. For foreigners in Korea, this matters in three practical ways. First, the chip sector heavily influences Korea's overall growth, exports, and the won. Strong chip earnings can support business sentiment and hiring, especially in tech corridors around Seoul and in major industrial regions. Second, it shapes national policy. When semiconductors are booming, lawmakers tend to compete over subsidies, R&D incentives, and infrastructure upgrades to keep investment onshore. Third, it can affect consumer markets. As supply chains stabilize, you may see faster product cycles and more aggressive pricing in smartphones, PCs, and high-end electronics. One note of caution: both companies are still navigating U.S. export controls and geopolitical risk around China. Even with great quarters, the industry's outlook depends on how quickly AI demand grows, and on whether global rules constrain where Korean chips can be sold. Still, the headline for today is clear. In the global AI era, Korea's memory giants are back in the driver's seat. As Korea approaches Seollal, Lunar New Year, the government is trying to manage two things at once: holiday travel chaos and holiday price spikes. For foreigners, this is one of the most practical news items of the day. According to Korean policy coverage, authorities announced a Seollal livelihood stability package that focuses on food prices, consumer rebates, just discounts, and transportation management. The logic is straightforward. During the holiday week, demand for fresh produce, meat, and gift sets rises sharply while logistics slow down. When both happen together, prices can jump. The government response is usually a mix of increased supply releases from reserves or coordinated wholesale distribution, retail discount programs, and tighter monitoring for price gouging in high-demand categories. On transport, the holiday pattern is predictable. Intercity travel surges, especially on the days before and after the main holiday, while many urban districts become quieter as residents leave for hometowns. That means highways can be packed, KTX and long-distance buses sell out quickly, and major stations get crowded. Even if you don't travel, you'll feel it in Seoul through altered business hours and changed service patterns. Here are the practical tips for non-Koreans. First, book intercity transport early if you plan to move between cities. Second, expect some smaller restaurants, local clinics, and offices to close for a couple of days. Check Google Neighbor listings in advance and don't assume normal hours. Third, if you're sending packages, do it earlier. Delivery networks can slow during the holiday rush. Fourth, if you're shopping for gifts or cooking, compare major retailers' holiday discount programs because they often bundle rebates and coupons tied to cards or membership apps. Seollal is also a great cultural moment. If you can visit palaces, folk villages, or major museums running holiday events, but do plan around crowds. The big idea? Treat Seollal like a national-scale long weekend. If you plan early, it's manageable, and even fun. Housing policy in Korea can feel like a maze. But today's headlines carried a clear signal. The government is trying to shape market expectations without promising a sudden, dramatic policy pivot. Korean reports said the finance ministry indicated it would not extend a temporary capital gains tax relief measure for multi-home owners. In plain terms, that suggests the government wants to avoid incentives that could be seen as favoring speculative multi-home ownership, while still balancing concerns about market stability. Around the same time, policy discussion continued about expanding housing supply, the longer-term lever that policymakers often say is necessary to stabilize prices. For foreigners, the immediate question is, will this change my rent? The honest answer is that housing tax changes usually hit renters indirectly, and with a lag. Landlords respond to taxes by adjusting buying, selling, or holding decisions, and those decisions can influence supply in the rental market. If some owners decide to sell rather than hold multiple properties, it can increase transaction activity and potentially expand long-term rental supply. On the other hand, if uncertainty rises, landlords may try to pass costs through, depending on local market power and competition. Also remember Korea's unique rental systems. In Jeonse, large deposit, low, no monthly rent markets, expectations about interest rates can matter as much as taxes. In Wol's monthly rent markets, cash flow pressures matter more. If policy signals push more properties onto the sales market, you may see more listings. But whether that lowers rent depends on neighborhood-level supply and demand. Practical advice: if you are renewing a contract soon, track comparable listings in your area and negotiate using data. If you are new to Korea, understand the basics of deposit structures, agency fees, and contract protections. And consider having a bilingual contract review, because misunderstandings often come from clauses rather than from the headline rent number. Finally, treat today's policy story as a signal, not a guarantee. Korea's housing market is politically sensitive, and messaging can shift quickly based on prices, interest rates, and public pressure. North Korea is sending a familiar but still serious message. It wants the world to believe its nuclear posture is expanding, and it's backing that message with weapons demonstrations. International coverage today said North Korea plans to unveil steps to bolster or upgrade its nuclear deterrent at an upcoming ruling party Congress, while state media highlighted new missile-related activity. Separate reporting said the North fired at least one short-range ballistic missile into the sea, with South Korea tracking the launch. Another report described leader Kim Jong-un observing a drill involving upgraded multiple rocket launchers, and notably appearing alongside his young daughter, a detail that South Korean and international analysts often read as a signal of long-term regime continuity. Why does this matter for foreigners in Korea? First, because North Korea headlines can change market mood fast. Even when nothing escalates, missile tests can move the one, drive risk-off headlines, and dominate diplomatic messaging. Second, it affects practical travel planning. Most of the time, daily life in Seoul continues normally after a test, but alert levels can shift. Major public events sometimes tighten security, and travelers may want to monitor official advisories if they have flights, ferry trips, or tightly scheduled itineraries. It also matters strategically. A party Congress announcement can be used to lock in a long-term doctrine, more tactical nuclear systems, more solid fuel missiles, and a narrative that North Korea will not bargain away its arsenal. That, in turn, shapes how South Korea, the US, and Japan respond, whether through deterrence messaging, joint exercises, or sanctions enforcement. At the same time, it's important not to exaggerate. A missile test does not automatically mean a crisis is imminent. The pattern is often signal, test, negotiate, a cycle designed to keep attention and maintain leverage. But the cumulative effect is real. It normalizes a higher baseline of tension. For viewers outside Korea, the takeaway is that the security backdrop remains active. For people inside Korea, keep perspective, follow official alerts, and avoid misinformation during high-traffic news moments. The strongest signal today is not one specific launch. It's Pyongyang's intention to frame nuclear capability as permanent, upgradable, and central to regime identity. Another major legal headline today comes from Korea's long-running real estate corruption investigations. The cluster of cases often associated with Daejang-dong and other large development projects. Korean court coverage reported that a Seoul court found Yoo Dong-yu and Nam-wook not guilty in the Wirye Newtown, Wirye, development corruption case. The Wirye case has been seen as closely connected to, or at least strongly analogous with, the broader Daejang-dong development scandal because it involves allegations about preferential project approvals, private profit, and how key insiders influenced public development decisions. For non-Koreans, this sounds like a domestic political soap opera, but it connects to issues that matter to residents: how land is developed, who captures the gains, and why housing is expensive. Large-scale development scandals can also slow future projects because bureaucracies become risk-averse. After a corruption case, officials may delay approvals, demand more paperwork, or avoid bold decisions. That can affect supply and indirectly prices. Legally, an acquittal like this doesn't necessarily end the story. Prosecutors can appeal and separate cases may continue, but the public impact is immediate. Opponents interpret acquittals as proof that investigations were politicized, while prosecutors argue that wrongdoing occurred but is hard to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. That split fuels polarization and can spill into electoral narratives. There's also an institutional lesson. Development cases are complex. They involve layers of contracts, land rights, procurement decisions, and informal influence networks. Courts may require very specific proof of quid pro quo exchanges, not just "this looks suspicious." When evidence is circumstantial, acquittals become more likely. For foreigners living in Korea, the practical takeaway is to watch how this affects housing policy debates. When corruption cases dominate the discourse, politicians often respond by promising tougher oversight, new transparency tools, or reform of public-private partnerships. Those changes can affect how quickly new housing and infrastructure projects move, and that matters for renters, buyers, and businesses planning long-term in Korea. A story that directly affects daily life in Seoul, especially for commuters, is back in the headlines. The legal fight over disability rights protests on the subway system. Korean reporting today said a Seoul court handed down a prison sentence to a key figure in the Solidarity Against Disability Discrimination, SADD, movement over subway protests that disrupted train operations. The case revolves around repeated demonstrations demanding stronger disability mobility rights, including better accessibility funding, more support for independent living, and commitments to barrier-free public transportation. Prosecutors have argued the protests crossed legal lines by obstructing operations and causing public inconvenience. Activists argue disruption is the only tool that forces the public and politicians to pay attention to chronic underfunding. For foreign residents, this is not just a culture war story, it's a practical transit issue. When protests occur, delays can spread quickly across lines, and English language information may be limited in real time. If you commute during peak hours, especially through major transfer stations, it's worth following official subway operator updates and live map services during politically sensitive moments. The wider policy question is hard. How do you balance the rights of people with disabilities to access public infrastructure with the right of commuters to reliable transportation? Korea's disability rights movement argues that invisible barriers, broken elevators, inaccessible stations, limited mobility services are a daily exclusion that most able-bodied commuters don't see. Opponents argue that blocking trains harms working people and that policy change should happen through legislation, not disruption. A court sentence doesn't end this debate. It may intensify it, either by deterring protests or by radicalizing them. Historically, social movements often face a legal crackdown phase and then pivot tactics. More lobbying, more media campaigns, more lawsuits, or more targeted direct action. For non-Koreans watching Korea, this is a reminder that social policy can become street-level conflict, especially in a dense city where public transit is the bloodstream. If you live in Seoul, the best approach is to stay informed, plan buffer time on protest-heavy days, and understand that behind the delays is a bigger argument about what a truly inclusive city requires. If you're in Seoul this week, the biggest weather theme is classic late January Korea. Cold mornings, sharper wind chill at times, and noticeable day-to-day temperature swings. Today's conditions remain wintry, with early hours feeling much colder than the afternoon. Expect dry air, yes, which can irritate eyes and skin. And pay attention to wind chill if you're outside for long periods. For walkers, the safety risk often comes not from heavy snow but from black ice on shaded sidewalks and bridge approaches, especially after overnight freezing. Looking into the next 7 days, forecasts suggest mostly seasonal cold with a few modest ups and downs rather than a dramatic warm spell. That usually means 1. Mornings staying below freezing on several days, 2. Afternoons that can feel relatively mild in the sun, and 3. The possibility of a brief snow or light precipitation window, depending on passing systems. Even light snow can create slippery conditions because it melts in the afternoon and refreezes at night. Practical tips for foreigners and travelers. Layer clothing rather than relying on one heavy coat. You'll often feel warm indoors, but cold outdoors. Wear shoes with grip if you walk a lot. Seoul's pavements can be slick in freezing conditions. If you drive, assume some roads will be icy early morning and late night, especially near rivers, ramps, and hills. If you're doing outdoor sightseeing, palaces, markets, hikes, aim for the midday window when temperatures are highest. For dry air, consider a small humidifier indoors and carry lip balm hand cream. If you're planning intercity travel for Seollal, keep checking forecasts and transport announcements. Even minor snow can slow buses and create highway delays. The good news is that Korea's transit system is resilient, but winter conditions reward planning and buffer time. Army's headline today: multiple entertainment outlets report that BTS has announced a new world tour titled ARIRANG, and that tickets sold out quickly across major markets. The immediate story is the sellout. But for fans, the more useful question is what comes next. Added dates, ticket resales, and official updates. First, remember how big-ticket K-pop tours typically unfold. Initial dates sell out fast, especially when pre-sales, fan verification systems, and limited seat allotments concentrate demand into narrow time windows. After that, promoters often assess venue logistics and announce additional shows or upgraded seating sections if feasible. That means sold out on day 1 doesn't always mean no chance. It often means wait for the next wave. Second, watch official channels only. With a global fandom, scams scale quickly. If you're overseas and planning a Korea trip around a BTS show, do not rely on unofficial resellers that ask for bank transfers or screenshots. Look for the official ticketing platform named in the announcement and the group's verified social accounts. If there is an official resale partner, use that. Third, plan the travel layer early. In Korea, major concert weeks can tighten hotel availability in Seoul and spike transportation demand on weekends. If you already have a ticket, lock in lodging with flexible cancellation. If you don't have a ticket yet, consider waiting before booking a non-refundable trip. Fourth, Expect content marketing around the tour. A new tour cycle usually comes with releases, behind-the-scenes clips, merch drops, special collaborations, or documentary-style content. For international fans, that's part of the tour experience, even before the show date. The bottom line for today? Treat the sellout headline as confirmation that demand is still massive. The practical fan strategy is patience plus verification. Monitor official updates for added dates and resale rules and avoid the noise. K-Culture fans got a new music headline today. Korean outlets report that singer-songwriter Heize released a new collaboration track with rapper-producer Giriboy. Even if you don't follow every release calendar, this pairing matters because it's a classic melodic storyteller plus experimental hip-hop mix. The kind of collab that tends to travel well internationally. Here's what fans usually look for in a Heize x Giriboy style release. First is texture. Heize's vocals often sit in that space between pop and R&B, with lyrical clarity that makes songs feel like diary entries. Giriboy's production and verse choices often add unpredictability. Switches in rhythm, slightly off-kilter synth lines, or beat changes that keep a track from feeling too clean. When these two worlds meet, the result is typically emotional but not sentimental. It's moody, a little ironic, and sonically modern. For international listeners, the easiest way to track official releases is to watch the major platforms: Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube Music, plus Korea's domestic charts, Melon, Genie. K-pop and K-hip-hop releases often show different performance patterns on Korean charts versus global streaming, so both views matter if you're measuring impact. Fans also watch YouTube performance. Lyric videos, live clips, and short-form edits can turn a quiet track into a viral sound. If you're living in Korea, this is also a good moment to check for live events. Collabs sometimes lead to small showcase appearances, festival sets, or TV radio performances that can be easier to attend than large idol concerts. And they're often more friendly to casual listeners. The takeaway: this isn't just another single. It's a collaboration that sits in the center of Korea's modern pop R&B hip-hop crossover scene. If you like emotionally direct music with a sharper production edge, this is a release worth adding to your playlist. And watching for live stages. If you're a Korea-based movie fan, or visiting and looking for what locals are actually watching, today's box office headline is clear. Korean reports say the film Once We Were Us has climbed to the top spot and surpassed 2.11 million cumulative admissions. That number matters because Korean box office performance is still heavily driven by local word-of-mouth and theater-going patterns. When a film crosses the 2 million mark, it signals that it's no longer a niche title. It has reached a mass audience, which often triggers more showtimes, more premium screens, and more media coverage. For foreign viewers, that means more opportunities to see it in theaters, and potentially better availability of English subtitles depending on the cinema chain and location. Here's how to use this information if you're not Korean. First, check the big multiplex chains, CGV, Lotte Cinema, Megabox, for subtitle screenings. In Seoul, especially in areas with more international residents, English sub-sessions are more common. Second, if you're planning a cultural itinerary, box office hits can be a good snapshot of what the public mood is consuming right now. The kind of cultural data you can't get from tourist brochures. This also has industry implications. A strong domestic box office can influence investors and distributors. It makes them more confident about funding similar projects and scheduling releases around competitive windows. It can also shape streaming timelines. High theater performers sometimes hold longer exclusive windows before landing on OTT services, depending on contracts. For K-culture followers, a box office leader is often connected to an ecosystem. Cast interviews, variety show appearances, OST releases, and behind-the-scenes clips that spill onto YouTube and social media. If you like following the whole cycle, not just the movie, keep an eye on those secondary content streams. Bottom line: Once We Were Us being number one with over 2.11 million admissions is a useful signal that theaters in Korea are still capable of generating big domestic hits. If you're in Korea this week, it's one of the most current cultural experiences you can buy with a ticket.